Glad to see you all here this morning. Some of us are even ready to go. I wish I was. Let's start with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we're thankful for this opportunity to gather together to study the history of your church, how it came about, how it developed, and how it got to be what we have today. We ask that you'd open our minds and our hearts to understand what went on back in these times and the reasons that were there for us, and see your hand in its resolution. We ask this name in Jesus' name. Amen. As you can see on the screen, our assignment today is Constantine and the Christian Empire. And I forgot something that I need to be able to see my notes with. There. No, don't help. No, in the 4th century, this is the 300 to 400 ADs, it was defined by a shift of Christianity and a split between the East and the West empires. And we're going to see the start of that shift and the start of that split today. And some key events that was included in Constantine's was the legalization of Christianity and a couple councils, one of Nicaea and one of Constantinople, that he organized. The rise of the thing we call monasticism. This is where the guys either head out into the wilderness to commune with the Lord all by themselves, or the whole bunch gather into a community. We call them monks, nuns, and monasteries. And they did this in an attempt to get away from what they didn't like about the church. I'm ahead of myself and probably stepping on somebody else's teachings, but we'll just keep it going. Christianity became a state religion at that time, and one of the things that's not really brought out much in the history, but we did have at this time the canonization of the New Testament that we have today. So this was a pivotal era, the 4th century, with the shift of church-state relationships coming from conflict with each other to the church being seen as imperial favor. You might say this is where you see the first marriage of the joining of the church and state together. So, as was presented, the first part of our study was this chart showing where we're going to be going. So where are we in this age of the church history? We're now starting in the 4th section, as you can see are in red, and that section covers ages of church history from the 4th, 5th, and 6th century, or the years 300 through 700. However, this session today, I am not covering those 300 years of church history. We're just going to be covering the 4th century, primarily the 300s. And the events of those other years of that block are going to be covered into future sessions. The handout you have is a listing of, to help keep straight, and I had trouble doing it, the emperors that were the Roman emperors of this 4th century period. I've listed some of the, when they ruled, which empire, whether they were the East, whether they were the West, or whether they were both, and some of their impacts that they did have on church and on the empire. And I think it's important, it was for me anyway, to keep them straight. I don't intend to go through these one by one since you have them right there. My goodness, some of you got the already highlighted copies. That's generally what happens when I start highlighting. You know, everything's important, and I just as well highlight it with a spray painter rather than a highlighter. But some of the key things onto there is that, I'm going to try to say it right the first time, so then it'll go there. Diocletian, the emperor in the East, shared rule with Maximian, the emperor of the West, and later on he established his 4 areas with each with their own ruler. And this Diocletian and Maximian had the title of Augustus, where Galerius and Constantius the First were kind of co-rulers with these other two guys, and they had the title of Caesar. There's a distinction and a difference between those two. The Augustus was like the general, and a Caesar would be like a colonel, and each of them would have their own commands or their own troops, but when they got together, the colonel saluted the general. That's the kind of the relationship that these four people had with each other. Two of them being called Augustus and the other two being called Caesar. Not called, that was their titles. And one other thing about that Constantius I, just for future note, he is the father of Constantine. They didn't illustrate a whole lot of originality in naming names back in those days. I can't understand that, because if you see in the right underneath the Constantine I the Great, he named his kids Constantine II, Constance, and Constantius. I mean, didn't the mother have an input on that names? Or maybe she did, I don't know. But anyway, after Constantine died, the point here is that he divided his empire into three parts, with each of these boys, being the ruler of those parts. And, of course, civil war followed, and Constantius, not Constantine, Constantius II, not Constantius the First. Anyway, he went out, and I put a note in here. Is this a display of Christian brotherly love? These three brothers, each of them have a fairly large area that they're in charge of, but somebody wanted all the cookies and got them all. And that would be that Constantius II. Well, and some notes about him. He did ban pagan religions, but he didn't close it down completely. And as you see in your notes, it kind of hung around a little bit. And also during his time, there was this conflict we call Arianism, that we're going to learn about next week, I think. So he was siding with the Arians in this conflict of Arianism. And then comes along just Julian guy. He didn't rule for very long, but he went just the other side and he didn't outlaw Christianity, but he renounced Christianity, and he brought in this Hellenistic or a Neoplatonic, I'm not even quite sure what that means. I know what plate tectonics are. But a mystical form of a pagan religion he brought into there and tried to get it going. And he wanted to get it in. He just says, well, let's just modify some of the Christian practices just a little bit to make them more acceptable to them. Well, then come along this Jovian guy you'll see under here. He ended Julian's efforts and reestablished Christianity. Not going to go through much more of them. I think the point you can see here is during this period of time, here come this emperor that was pro-Christian, here come this emperor that was anti, here come this emperor that was kind of, I don't care, as long as they don't bother me, I won't bother them kind of attitude. Can you imagine the whiplash the people of the country would have with this vacillation back and forth? Maybe we can, but I won't talk about our national elections. Anyway, going on through the list there, you can read it there, I won't have to. We want to move on into what happened with the empire before Constantine. We need to start looking, what did Constantine inherit as he came in as an emperor? And Diocletian. He took office in the signs of a crumbling empire. And this crumbling empire was evident by assassinations of one emperor after another and corruption within the administration. the previous 100 years before he took over, there were 30 different emperors, kind of like one every 3.5 years. That's not quite, that's the average, because some of them only served for months before the next guy decided, I kind of want his job, off with his head. Well, Diocletian, right after he was elected, his nearest rival was there on the Senate floor with him. He jumped, this according to history, jumped on him and ran him through. Says took care of that. And also, I think he left a pretty solid message for anybody else that might be thinking about that. But anyway, he in his 20-year reign, he did bring the empire from this almost the brink of extinction onto a vigorous and stability government. He turned back the German retreat and the Roman retreat in Germany. See, at the time he took over, you can see on the map, the Germanic peoples was starting to push south, and the Roman army was also pushing south. Well, he pushed them back, and then also conquered Britain, the yellow part clear in the upper left, and Persia. He reconquered those lands that had been taken. And in this attempt, he also, as I said earlier, he divided the country into 4 parts, which you can see by the 4 colors. And this Constantius was into the yellow area. And he was, now remember the Caesar and Augustus? Well, he was called a Caesar. He was a junior, or the colonel, if you will. And this was the guy, for future reference, that was the father of Constantine. Okay, and Maximum, he was the Augustus, the green area, if you can't quite read the legend from your seat. And then there was a Galerius. He was the pink area. And this, if you remember, would be the area that Paul did a lot of his missionary journeys in. And then there was a Diocletian, and he was, as Augustus, he was in that purple area, clear down to the far right side. I think that, and historians think, the reason for him splitting up his empire like this is instead of one guy wanting to knock him off and succeed to be an emperor, this one guy, if he had those ambitions, he'd have to plan and plot and knock 3 guys off to get, so it'd be a little bit harder to take over. They think that's why he might have done that. And of course, so it might be he's getting old and tired and wanted to retire. So Diocletian began persecution of the Christians in his district later on in his reign. It's interesting that for 18 years he didn't pay no attention to them, but in the last 2 years of his reign, he decided, we got to do something. So he ordered the churches to be burned. And remember, at this time, there was a lot of house churches at that time. So is it implied that the burning of the churches meant that they also went out and burned down the private houses where the churches met? And had scriptures burned. And the church historian, Eusebius, recorded this event in his, we saw with our very eyes the inspired and sacred scriptures committed to the flames of the marketplaces. So as it said, for 18 years, he had maintained his pagan views, paying no mind to the growing Christian population. And here on the map, you can see kind of where the concentration of the Christians were, their influence was at. But suddenly, he issues edicts that bring about severe persecution. And what was the possible reason for this? Well, if you put on back here, this was the area that he wound up with. And you can see it's mostly in the green. He might have thought, if I get invaded from the north or from the east, these Christians might join in with the invaders and going to give me a whole lot of problem. Does that sound familiar? Remember Pharaoh? Yeah. So Diocletian solved the problem, not in the manner Pharaoh did. Pharaoh made them slaves. But Diocletian got rid of all the Christians out of his army, started tearing down the Christian buildings, says you can't, if you worship as a Christian anymore, it's death to you, killing off the bishops. It just overall attempt to wipe out the Christian communities was his goal. And as a result of the bloodiness and massacre, because you could see from the map how many people were into there. I mean, there was a lot of Christians spread throughout his area. And as I'd said earlier, the guy right next to him up in the Asian Peninsula where Paul had ministered, he was about the same, but the other two guys far off in the west weren't quite that bad. But anyway, even the pagans were sickened by that bloodshed that resulted from his edicts. Now, and as I said earlier, that persecution was more intense in the east where there was more Christians to persecute. Duh, that makes sense, doesn't it? Than there was into the west. But Constantius, Constantine's father, he never pursued those edicts very vigorously. Even though the general said, do this, the colonel in his own command says, oh, I'm going to modify that just a little bit. He suspended all the severe measures and started showing signs of favor to the Christians, while Galerius, rolling right next door, couldn't quite get away with that impunity, if you will, but he was more relentless in his persecutions. So in comes, we get to Constantine. And church history in the 4th century, as I'd said earlier, was defined by this transition of Christianity from this persecuted minority to a dominant religion in the Roman Empire. And this was the beginning then of the Christianization of the empire, and also the beginning of imperial interference into church matters. Now, previously, the emperor did interfere with Christians because they were Christians. He didn't get involved in the operation of the Christians or the church. But the good news is, this was a time for the courageous Christian martyrs having to give up their lives, dying for their beliefs, started to become a thing of the past. As one of the commentators put it, Constantine helped Christianity move from the seclusion of the catacombs to the prestige of the palace. Now, some saw this movement as a victory for religion. Others saw it as is culture captivating Christianity, taking it over? We're going to see more into that comment a little bit later on. So as Christianity become this legitimate religion, also controversies at the same time, controversies about what constituted this legitimate religion. What constituted Christian faith erupted. And this is where we get into the creeds, the what's the word for people gathering together? Anyway, the gathering together of the decision making, and that's next week's lesson, not this week's lesson. But momentous changes occurred both in the church and in the political structure of Rome during this time. So what started off to be a superstition called Christianity, how did it suddenly rise from the shadows to become a society, from the shadows of society to a spiritual leadership? How did this happen almost seemingly overnight? This is where Constantine comes in. And I keep thinking when I see that Constantine rescues a church, way back when I was a kid, there was a cartoon, Mighty Mouse. Anybody remember that? Here I come to save the day. I just thought I'd throw that in for no extra charge. Okay, Constantine's history. He was known as Constantine the Great, or Constantine I, and the first emperor to convert to Christianity. And as I said before, he was a son of this Constantius, who was the ruler of the Britain area, clear off into the northwest corner of the empire. One of the four emperors of what's called the Tetrarchy, or four emperors. And his mother was named Helena, and it says she was a woman of low birth, and what that has to do with anything, I don't know, but the historian thought it was important, so I included it as well. And later on, the church revered her as a saint. And we're going to get into saints and stuff in a little bit later on. She's credited with the conversion of her son. Others believe it was Constantine that converted her. Back onto this saint thing, the veneration of Mary started to becoming more and more important about this time as well. And since Mary was the mother of Jesus that was promised to be the Messiah to get rid of the Roman Empire, maybe Helena, the mother of Constantine, who did relieve us from empire. This is just Dawn's thinking, so don't take it to the bank or anything. Maybe that's the reason that she achieved her sainthood. I don't know. But he did serve under almost all the other emperors. He spent some time in the East. He spent some time in the area of Asia, not the Far East Asia. And he gradually got moved over to the Yellow area with his father. And after his father died, his army declaimed him to be Augustus. Not Caesar anymore, but now you're Augustus. And to make that sure, he had to go to war with this Maximian, and at that time it was Licinius that had taken over for the name I can't say, Diocletian. There you go. I'll tell you what, these guys stuff. I finally figured out why I didn't do so swell in history, because if I couldn't pronounce the names, I couldn't memorize the names, and I couldn't even spell them on a test. That's the problem I got. And watching reruns of the Columbo movies, I got some of that going on myself, where did I leave stuff? Anyway, Constantine played a pivotal role, as I said, in the status of Christianity. He was instrumental in getting the Edict of Milan going, which decriminalized Christian practice and also ceased Roman Christian persecution. He founded the city, moved the capital over to Constantinople, and calling it the New Rome. And this movement, as we're going to see later on as we get through here, caused some decision or some tension between the Eastern and the Western churches, because at that time they still had their guy that was kind of in charge of the East and kind of in charge of the West in the church as well as in the empire. But once he defeated Maximian and became the empire over all of became the Caesar over all the empire, he was now able to implement the favor that he had just showed in the yellow area all over the whole Roman Empire. It's been commented his allegiance to Christianity was strong, but his understanding of the Christian faith was imperfect. Sometimes that hits close to my home too. So now the story of the conversion of Constantine. I don't know if anybody here has maybe not heard it, but you're going to get to hear another version of it anyway, or my version of it anyway. In 312, he was coming to Rome to do battle with Maximian to take over the entire empire, having already secured the other two areas. And the famous battle was a battle at the Milvian Bridge. And just before that battle, he saw a vision that he said was the result of his victory. So as the story goes, he saw a sign, the Greek letters Chi Rho, the first letters of the name of Christ, in the noonday sky, and also the words, "Conquer by this." And that night, as the story goes. I'm not saying it's true or untrue, I'm just saying as the story goes. Christ appeared to him in a dream and commanded him to use that sign as a safeguard. There it goes. And he had this sign. Now the chi, the X and the rho is the P top. And it's interesting that when I was a real youngster going, we had a youth group called Cairo, and I thought, does that have to do with a boat? No. Okay, back to the lesson. So he saw those letters and had them painted on the shields of his army, and they carried this to the battle, and he won the fight, and he attributed the victory to Christ. And converted over to Christianity. At least he subscribed to it. Although much of his life he lived as a pagan, he did convert to Christianity, and he was finally baptized at the end of his life by Eusebius of Nicomedia, and he happened to be an Arian persuasion bishop, and we're going to get to the difference of that later on, like next week later on. And I thought it was interesting. A lot of these guys, as you read in the history, they waited till the end of their life to get baptized. And I think they had a misunderstanding of what baptism was. It didn't wash all their sins, so that if they just behaved for those last little bit of their life, they could go to heaven all clean. But I think that's what they thought of baptism. See, as you go through some of this old stuff, we find out that there's nothing new under the sun. It just plays over and over and over, maybe with a different name, maybe with the same name. But he did have the Edict of Milan was what brought about Christianity being legalized, and the Council of Nicaea, that's the word I was looking for earlier, council. And it produced what we call the Nicene Creed, which is one of the creeds that we're going to be covering in our next session too. And he also had several churches built at one, and they called them basilicas, I'm not quite sure why, but one of the most famous ones they called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and that's built on the site that's supposedly where the tomb of Jesus was. And historically he's referred to as the first Christian Roman Empire. And some historians think this conversion might have been a little bit more political than religious. But if you look at what he did for the church after his conversion, it makes it hard to maintain that while he might have been not fully understanding, he still was in the area. Reminds me a lot about myself. Not fully understanding, but still believing. He did much to push Christianity into the Roman culture. So then we come towards the end of the active persecution. On your chart there, Galerius in 311, he was one of the leading figures in the persecutions, but later on in his life, as he lay dying, just before his death again, catch that trend, he had the Edict of Toleration toward Christians. Apparently he was afraid of dying, and he included in his request, in return for their tolerances, Christians will be required to pray to their God for us. And to my mind, this kind of further reinforces, no matter what you think, no matter what you say, deep down in your heart of hearts, you know. Deep down in your heart of hearts, you know. Well, he died 5 days later. The next thing that stopped the persecution was the Edict of Milan. And this was a document signed by Constantine and Licinius. And this ended the persecutions. And part of it said, We therefore announce that, notwithstanding any provisions concerning the Christians in our former instructions, all who choose that religion are permitted to continue therein without any let or hindrance, and are not to be in any way troubled or molested. Can you imagine the Christians heaving a sigh of relief when they heard that read? So from 313 to 380, Christians enjoyed the status of being one of the legal religions of the empire. They didn't become the sole religion until later on. But it did gradually attain prominence and stature in the Roman society. So this is a list of the changes that Constantine brought about for Christianity. It was a turning point for the church. And this tax exemption to the clergy that he granted, point number C, was also the same exemption that was granted to pagan priests at that time. So he elevated the Christian ministers up to the level of pagan priests. Now that wasn't good, but it was gaining. And the gladiators were probably real happy to see about number E. And we're going to talk in a little bit about Sunday becoming a public holiday. And he brought Christians into his administration, not the janitor jobs, but maybe the heads of departments and jobs. And he returned that church property that Diocletian had confiscated earlier. These were some big changes. See, he was utilizing Christian symbols. He was favoring Christians in his reign, but he still encouraged traditional religious practices, including the sun worship. And his city of Constantinople would gradually become called the center of the Christian world. And another note there, at his baptism, again just shortly before his death, after his baptism, he refused to wear the royal purple anymore, and he died in his white baptismal clothes. They put a lot of stress on what that baptism would do for you. In fact, there still hangs around there. I think it's Randy Travis has a song about the town drunk went and got baptized, and he felt sorry for all the fish downstream because of all those sins being washed off of the town drunk and down there. But we can get confused sometimes, can't we? So Eusebius called Constantine the ideal Christian leader and saw this as just the beginning of the new age of salvation, which kind of put, in other words, was Constantine's conversion a result of divine providence, just as the preparation of Rome, the language, the roads, the peace, was for the birth of Christ. See, when we start getting outside of what's written in the Scripture, we can start drawing these connections that are totally unbiblical, but sound kind of maybe believable if you really work at it. So, those advantages of the church did come with a price. Constantine ruled the bishops the same as he ruled his civil servants, his administrator heads. He demanded the obedience to his edicts, even if they intervened or interfered with the pure church matters. And another price that paid prior to this, the church body consisted of what we would call devout believers. I mean, if you were a believer, your life was in danger. You're not going to play around at this. Now, as you could say, the pews were filled with newly baptized pagans. The result, the church then was filled with religiously disinterested members, still half-rooted in paganism, with secularism being rampant, and using religion for political purposes or personal gain. So we have this mix then of church, state, and paganism. In making that first day of the week a holy day, holiday, not holy day, he named it what we would translate to the day of the sun, in honor of his favorite pagan god, the sun. And also the church started to take over other pagan customs, like the birthday of the pagan sun god, December 25th. And other pagan customs, the use of candles, use of incense, the use of garlands hanging around. They were initially avoided in the church at this time, but later brought in. Then we had also changes going on within the church itself, in that with Christianity, with its first imperial protector, they no longer needed to fear persecution. Because of this, churches changed style, and the Christians changed a little bit in practice. Most of the more resources were available to spend on building churches, which replaced the need for house churches. And Christians spent their effort in developing Christian thought, Christian education, Christian writing, which led to these disagreements of Christian doctrine that we're going to be discussing later on. And the churches themselves inside developed more elaborate ceremonies, such as a clerical dress, or it's called vestments, that's used during services, the use of incense, processionals before and after the worship to bring in the air of awe and wonder, and even choirs to sing the heavenly anthems. Moving along. When you consider the saints and the martyrs, the historian called these a cult of saints and martyrs that grew rapidly in the 4th century, and he called it a blend of paganism and Christianity. And I wondered about what did he mean by that, and I finally come up with pagans had gods for everything in their lives. There was a god of fertility, the god of the rain, the god of et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, saints, there were saints that were able to cure illnesses. There were saints that were able to protect travelers. There were saints that were able to detect whether or not you were lying. And there were saints able to foretell the future and heal sickness, on and on and on. You see how we brought something in and it got adopted and spread? I might be stretching that a little bit, but I don't think so. Now, the church wasn't teaching saint worship. Don't get that idea. But they did kind of allude to, well, these saints, they're already up into heaven. They can hear your petitions and deliver them directly to God, kind of a little bit faster than you might too, because of having to go through the atmosphere. And martyrs also received this special recognition from the church. These were special people, and as a result of this special emphasis on the martyrs, there was an effort, now we need to gather up a bone, a relic, a piece, of something from this martyr to have it sitting here in our church so it can be honored, which is just a step away from reverenced. But then paganism started getting suppressed. Earlier, we talked about Constantine had moved a little bit slower at getting rid of paganism. He did bring in the legality of Christianity, but he didn't make paganism not an illegality, that's not a word, making it illegal. One of the reasons is most of his subjects were still of this pagan nature, and he didn't want to upset the apple cart, so to speak, so he just kind of, well, let's bring the Christianity into the realm, but not throw anything else out. Can we just get along, coexist? I keep thinking of that bumper sticker all the time. But Constantinus II, he proceeded more vigorously. He closed temples, he prohibited sacrifices on the pain of death, and his reign showed, even though he was doing this stuff to get rid of paganism, what he was really doing it for was to get unity into the church. And in his efforts to do this, you see, truth and liberty suffer if church unity is the ultimate or the only goal. And the end of the pagan religions came about slowly and a piece at a time when Gratian declined the title of Pontifex Maximus, the Lord High Poobah, or whatever you want. He brought an end to that state Roman religion because this title carried with it the authority and ties within the administration of the Roman religion. So basically it offended official state practices of religion, but not the private religious practices or the temples of the Roman religion. However, come 380, when Theodosius issued the Edict of Thessalonica, it mandated that all of his subjects are now Christians and will follow the Nicene Creed, effectively making Christianity the state religion and forced all the subjects to become members. And in the following years, he also issued several edicts banning pagan practices, closing pagan temples, and abolishing pagan holidays. So then we come to the section of the emperor and the church, getting more zoomed in on what has the emperor to do with the church. This question was attributed to Bishop Donatus during his disagreement with the church, and that's known as the Donatist controversy. Oh, guess what? Covered later? Yes. Most of the conflicts between the church and state from the 4th century on had to do with this question. What business is it of the emperor to dabble into strictly church affairs? Yeah, let him run the country. However, most of the people, the populace, the John public on the street, agreed the emperor had a lot to do with the church, and this was a carryover from his living in the Roman Empire before Christianity was made legal. In that empire, the emperor had a lot to do with everything. He was the ultimate ruler of the empire. Everything comes back to him. Even the argument Paul had with the Jewish believers went back to the emperor of the Roman Empire. And the details of these controversies and their resolution is going to be covered next week, of course. But during the time we're looking at, the church did discover a new power against the kryptonite. By 830, rewards for Christians gave way to penalties for non-Christians when Theodosius made Christian belief an imperial command. Now, the Eastern Church, or the Greek Orthodox Church, whichever one you want to call it, accepted the concept of emperor rule over the church. But in the West, there was this guy named Ambrose, who was the bishop of Milan. He challenged the right of the emperor to interfere in church business. Now, we're seeing two contrasting attitudes between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. I had to do it the right way because that is East. Eastern Church and Western Church. These difference of the attitudes in that conflict kind of give us a clue as to their drifting apart as time goes along. And as we work through this session on the history of the church, we're going to see that drifting apart. But there's two major conflicts between Bishop Ambrose and Emperor Theodosius that really strengthened the church's power. The Callinicum incident of 388. The conflict. In this town, a mob of Christians, led by their local bishop, robbed and burned a Jewish synagogue. That's the background story. Theodosius, in his effort to maintain civil order, ordered the bishop to rebuild the temple at his own expense and punish those that were responsible. Well, Ambrose decided, I need to get involved. I need to throw my 2 cents in. He wrote a fiery protest to the emperor, arguing that making a Christian bishop build a house of worship for unbelievers, Jews, was a betrayal of the faith an act of apostasy. That was Ambrose's position. Well, the outcome, the emperor ignored the letter, but he did show up at a church service in Milan where Ambrose was officiating, and when it come time for communion, he told the emperor, "No way, Jose," refused him communion until the emperor rescinded the order. Well, the emperor finally did give in and rescind the order, effectively granting these Christians immunity from their work at destroying the temple. So, scores: Ambrose 1, Theophilus 0. The next incident is called the Thessalonian Massacre. And this was caused by an angry mob rioted in Thessalonica after the Roman military commander arrested a popular local charioteer. And I'm guessing this popular local charioteer was involved in the chariot races, and he was the hero. Well, the angry mob murdered the commander and several other officials and released the charioteer. And I thought, how do we put that into perspective? What would you think would happen if the mayor of Denver arrested Bo Nix just before the NFL playoffs? Kind of a similar thing happened. See, our sports hero takes over our common sense. Did I say it out loud? Anyway, enraged, Theodosius ordered the indiscriminate slaughter of those cities' inhabitants. If that's the way they're going to behave, we're going to take care of them all. So the soldiers let the citizens back into the stadium and massacred them. Historians estimate there was 7,000 massacred. Mile High Stadium would hold a lot more, wouldn't it? Well, Ambrose again, he was appalled by this indiscriminate slaughter, and he excommunicated the emperor this time. In a private letter, he informed Theodosius that he would not offer him communion until he performed public penance for that sin of the massacre. Well, Theodosius eventually submitted, laying aside his royal ornaments and vestures. He performed 8 months of public penance as a common mourner. Ambrose finally admitted him into communion on Christmas Day of 390. Ooh, that's the birthday of the sun god, wasn't it? Okay, in these two confrontations, Ambrose, maybe unwittingly, but he hit on a new weapon to control the emperor. The weapon was used again and again throughout the years by other bishops to control. And not just control the emperor. Threat of excommunication was used to control a lot of folks, especially during the Inquisitions. And this event, back on to today, established that principle of the emperor is in the church, not above the church. Drastically starting a power shift between church and state. So back to the question, what does the emperor to do with the church? The answer being, not as much as he thought. Christianity in the 4th century was changed in its early stages by Constantine, by the First Council of Nicaea, and that was the beginning of 7 councils throughout this 300 to 700 period. And in the late stages, that Edict of Thessalonica made Christianity the state church of the empire. Some results of these things happened is Christian increased in numbers. At the first part of the 300s, when this persecution was going on, it's been estimated that 10% of the Rome population in 300 was Christian. And that's when Diocletian launched his campaign trying to wipe out the Christians, but that persecution failed. It turned the tide of growth in the region, and because of the rapid growth, by 350, Christians accounted for 56.5% of the population. When I read those numbers, I thought, that's interesting. How did they come up with 56.5? Was it 56.4? Did they have an actual census? Did somebody really crunch the numbers? I don't have the answers to those, but those are some things that comes up to mind when I see facts and figures. Are they real? But anyway, you can see even from 10 to 50 was a huge, huge increase of the city of Rome of Christians. Now, got to keep in mind, part of this wasn't because they saw the light. Part of this because they saw the sword. During this period of time, we saw more of the institutionalization of the church. See, before it was kind of a loose organization, meeting in house churches, somebody getting up and talking, and another guy getting up and explaining, and another guy pulling out the scripture they had. Kind of a loose thing, but they started developing, adopting, if you will, Roman administrative structures where the bishop gained political influence. See, now this bishop isn't what we would have as a minister. This bishop was a guy in a major city that had control over the churches all around that major city. The priests were the one that was the kind of the preachers at that local city, even though they were sometimes called bishops. But we had bishops, and then we had bishops. And then we had the bishop of bishops. But that's way ahead of today's lesson. And also, that was the hierarchies of bishops that I just described. And the third institutionalization, while there were lists that came out that had some books of the New Testament in, some books of the New Testament out, we finally, at this period of time, received a list that has become our list for today's New Testament period. And also during this point of time, the East-West differences became more exaggerated, more important, and more dividing. The split between the Latin West and the Greek East, and those two terms might tell you a little bit about what that split was about. Language barrier. And also some theological focuses between the two of them. As we talked about earlier, in the West, we don't subscribe so much to the authority of the emperor in our church business. And in the East, we're okay with the emperor settling our disputes, resolving our differences, helping us to just get along. And the events to this schism weren't just theological or language. You also had political, cultural, and other differences mixed in to this cause of just not getting along. And the division of the Roman Empire into the East and the West also had an impact on the division of the church into the East and the West. Because where the capital of the West was in Rome, that bishop started thinking, maybe I am the bishop. And over in Constantinople, the capital bishop of the East started thinking, well, maybe I am the bishop. So you can see the separation of the Roman Empire into the East and the West kind of parallel the separation of the church into the East and the West. Well, Theodosius died in 395. Following his death, that emperor divided. He had the empire for about 3 years under one control, but the next they divided it into the eastern and western halves, each with its own emperor, and this became permanent throughout the period of the Roman Empire. The invasions of the Western Empire made them a little bit weaker, where there weren't so many invasions of the Eastern Empire. And with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, that left a power vacuum. And the church, the bishops, their structure kind of naturally migrated into that power vacuum, where the bishops took to administering secular cities, secular domains, secular issues. And way later on, after the Dark Ages, when kings and queens started to try to reestablish their rule, it had to contend with that power that had been welded or gained by the church at this time, and they weren't too anxious to relinquish yet. We don't have any discussion questions, so you're free to discuss whatever you need to for the next few minutes, and I'll close with a word of prayer. Father, we're thankful for this opportunity to gather, to look at what happened back in those days. How did that change the church that Jesus left behind in 33 AD to the church that we have now in 2026? How did it develop? How did it grow? What are the things that we need to watch out for that we don't, in our life, in our thinking, commit the same errors, go down the same false trails, that we can stay true to your word as it's given to us in your gospel. In Jesus' name, amen.